He promised me forever, but all he gave me was empty words. I had to face the truth. He wasn't the one. He looked at me like I was the one he would always be with, the one he'd never leave. It was in the way he held me close when things were tough, in the way he promised that we'd face the world together, no matter what. "We'll make it together," he'd say, "forever." Those were the words that filled my heart with hope. I truly believed him. I thought we were different, that our love was special. We had so many plans, so many dreams about the future. There were moments when we'd sit together, talking about everything, what kind of house we'd have, where we'd travel, and what we'd do when we grew old. He promised me so many things. He promised me that I was his forever, and that forever would be full of love, laughter, and happiness. I felt safe with him. I felt like nothing could break us. But as time went on, I began to see the cracks, though I didn't want to. At first, they were small things, tiny actions that didn't quite match his words. He'd say one thing and do another. He'd promise to be there, but sometimes he wouldn't show up. It started with little things I thought didn't matter. But over time, I realized they were more than just mistakes. They were signs. At first, I ignored them, telling myself it was just a rough patch. Everyone has them, right? I made excuses for him because I wanted to believe in that promise. I wanted to believe in him. But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks turned into months, those small cracks turned into something bigger. He was no longer the man I thought I knew. He wasn't the person who made promises with such certainty. He wasn't the person who said he would love me forever. He was becoming someone I didn't recognize, and it hurt to admit it, but I couldn't ignore it anymore. The man I loved, the man who had promised me forever, had already started to slip away, and I was left holding on to something that was slipping through my fingers. The cracks were small at first, barely noticeable. I told myself, it's nothing. It happens in every relationship. He was just busy, distracted, or going through a rough time at work. I tried to convince myself that it wasn't anything to worry about, but as time passed, the small cracks turned into something much bigger. I began to notice the subtle changes. He wasn't as affectionate as he used to be. We stopped having the late-night talks, the kind where we'd share our dreams and laugh about silly things. He wasn't interested in making plans for the future anymore. The promises of forever seemed to be fading, like whispers on the wind. One evening, I had set up a nice dinner, hoping to reconnect. I wanted us to talk, to feel close again. But when he came home, his mind was elsewhere. He didn't seem to notice the candles, the effort I put into the meal, or even the time we could have spent together. He was distracted, absorbed in something I couldn't see. I asked him if everything was okay, and he just shrugged, saying, "I've had a long day. I'm tired." That was it. The excuses came more often. He'd promised to call, but then wouldn't. He'd say we'd spend the weekend together, but then would cancel at the last minute. And every time, I was left waiting, left wondering why he didn't want to be with me. It wasn't just the canceled plans. It was the emotional distance that grew between us. I would try to talk to him about how I was feeling, but his responses were always short. "You're overthinking it," he'd say. "We're fine." But we weren't fine. Something was wrong, and he wasn't willing to face it. He wasn't willing to admit that the promises he made were starting to mean less and less. I started to feel invisible. The love I thought we had didn't seem to matter anymore. The promise of forever was turning into a distant memory, something that had been said but was never truly meant. It was like he was drifting further away, and no matter how hard I tried to hold on, I couldn't pull him back. I began to realize that maybe he never intended to keep those promises. Maybe forever was just a word to him, something to say in the moment, but never something to build a life on. I was left with nothing, nothing but empty words and a heart that was slowly breaking. I woke up one morning with a heavy feeling in my chest, the kind you get when something isn't right, but you can't put your finger on it. As I made coffee in the kitchen, I thought back to the night before, the empty conversation, the distracted look in his eyes. It had been like that for weeks, maybe months, and it was becoming harder to ignore. The truth began to hit me like a wave, a sudden realization I couldn't shake off. He wasn't the man who had promised me forever. That person had faded, leaving behind a stranger I barely recognized. He'd stopped showing up for me, both physically and emotionally. Every time I reached out, he pulled back, and I had been so blinded by love and hope that I had convinced myself it would get better, that he would snap out of it, that this was just a phase. But it wasn't. It wasn't a phase. It was the end. I started to question everything, all the plans we had made, the life we had imagined together, the promise of forever. Was it ever real? Or had I been living in a dream, clinging to something that wasn't really there? I realized then that love wasn't enough to hold a relationship together. The promises, the sweet words, they didn't mean anything without the actions to back them up. I remember the exact moment I truly understood. We were sitting on the couch, like we had done so many times before, but this time, everything felt different. He was staring at his phone, not looking at me. I could feel the distance between us, even though we were sitting side by side. I finally broke the silence, asking the question I had been avoiding. What happened to us? Why do I feel so alone? He didn't look up from his phone. Nothing's wrong. You're overreacting, he said, his voice distant and uninterested. In that moment, something inside me broke. It wasn't anger that hit me. It was clarity. The truth was in front of me, and it was undeniable. He had stopped caring. He had stopped trying. And I had been holding on to a relationship that wasn't real anymore. I realized that I was the only one fighting. I was the only one who still believed in us, still believed in the promise of forever. But he had already given up. He had given me nothing. The hardest part of all was realizing that the promise he made to me wasn't just a broken promise. It was a lie. For so long, I had tried to make excuses for him. I believed in the love we shared, even when he wasn't showing up. I kept thinking that if I loved him enough, things would change. But the truth was clear. Love alone wasn't enough to make a relationship work. And I was giving more than I was receiving. I had tried so many times to get through to him. I had tried to open up, to show him that I still cared, that I still believed in us. But every time I was met with silence. Every time I was left alone with my thoughts, questioning myself. Why wasn't I enough? Why couldn't he see that I was doing everything I could? It became clear that nothing was going to change. He had already made up his mind. He had already walked away in his heart, even though his body was still there. The emotional distance between us had grown too wide, too deep. There was no bridge left to cross. I had to let go. It wasn't something I wanted to do. In fact, I fought it every step of the way. But deep down, I knew that holding on to something that wasn't real anymore was only going to hurt me more. I had given him everything I had, but I couldn't make him care. I couldn't make him keep his promises. It was time to stop waiting for someone who wasn't coming back. It was time to stop living in the past, chasing after a love that had faded away. It wasn't easy. Letting go never is. But I realized that I had to do it, not for him, but for me. I had to let go of the dream of forever, the future we once planned, and most importantly, I had to let go of the person I thought he was. The man who promised me forever was no longer the man I was holding on to. And in letting go, I found a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about love, heartbreak, and moving on. Have you ever had to let go of someone who promised you forever? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your story in the comments below. And remember, no matter how tough it gets, you are strong enough to move forward. See you in the next video.